All right, Crim 20, let's knock out Chapter 4, Probation and Intermediate Sanctions. And typically what we're talking about, well, with intermediate sanctions, these are things that might include some time in custody, but are not necessarily prison or jail. But they could include some time in jail, but it's kind of a long story. So let's move along and see if we can explain it a little bit better when we go into the chapter. So community corrections. Community corrections are ultimately what we talked about before, corrections, fixing a problem, but we're fixing the problem while the offender is still in the community, as opposed to the offender being inside a correctional facility or locked up. So community corrections is a booming business, and there are more people right now on probation than under any other form of correctional supervision. That means there are more people on probation than there are on parole, than there are in prison, than there are in jail. So community corrections is when people are being supervised while they are still in the community. So those criminal sanctions that involve community supervision of offenders make use of correctional program resources in the community and require offenders to abide by specified conditions to remain in the community. So ultimately, the judge is saying, I'm giving you an opportunity to live in the community under certain terms and conditions. Okay? That's, and probation, like I said, is the most common form of community corrections. So, John Augustus, he is my dude. He is known as the father of probation. So in or about 1841, John Augustus and his family owned a shoe factory. So they made shoes. They lived in Boston. And John was interested in the court system. So for whatever reason, he would go and hang out at the courthouse and watch the court proceedings. And as he watched, he became interested in the fact that a lot of the offenders simply were alcoholics, raging alcoholics, couldn't get their act together, and couldn't pay their fines to get out of jail so that they could get back to their lives. And then when they did get out, they would just go back to drinking, and then they would end up back in jail. So he kind of saw that cycle. And one day, he was in the courtroom, and he basically said, "Judge, you know what? I think I can help. Let me take this guy home. I'm going to teach him how to work at my shoe factory. I'm going to get him sober. I'm going to help him earn money to pay off his fines. Give him a job, give him something to live for, look forward to, and I'm going to bring him back to you a new man." And the judge was like, "Knock yourself out, John. Go ahead." And that literally was the beginning of the whole concept of probation in the United States. Just some random guy who thought that he could help. And it kind of grew from there. There were other people, typically these were wealthy people who basically just wanted to give back to the community, and they would offer to take these people home with them and quote unquote fix them, as far as they, in their minds, they were fixing people. And then ultimately, after years and years and years, it finally became a profession. Obviously, I was a probation officer. I did not take anybody home with me, nor would I have. I had my own family, and unfortunately, I'm too selfish to bring other people into my home when I was trying to be a parent to my own children. But this is the actual definition of probation: a prison sentence that is suspended on the condition that the offender follows certain terms and conditions and commits no further crime. So ultimately, these offenders are sentenced to prison, and then that sentence is suspended, or basically kind of just hanging over their heads for whatever period of time. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes it's 3 years, sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 10 years. It just kind of depends. Most adults, typically in Fresno County, we're talking 3 to 5 years. Juveniles in Fresno County, and I worked in Fresno County and in Tulare County. In Tulare County, If you were a juvenile, you were on probation until you turned 18. In Fresno, you were on probation typically for a year. And why was it different? Because Fresno had too many people on probation. If they kept every juvenile on probation until their 18th birthday, we never would have been able to handle the number of cases. So there's a method to the madness why they decide to keep people on for certain periods of time, but it just depends on the location typically. Your organization for a probation department is real similar to that of a police agency. It very small at the top. You have your one chief. It's kind of that whole triangular shape, the chain of command, chief, deputy chief, maybe. You have some directors. Then you might have some. I thought that I'd put in here managers. So. Typically, you have a lot of line staff at the bottom, and then you have smaller numbers of admin at the top. They do follow a strict chain of command. If you have a supervisor, you are going to your supervisor if you have an issue. You are not going to the chief. I did that one time. It was very interesting. I got in a lot of trouble. Don't do that. I would do it again, honestly, but anyways, long story. If I had you in class, I would tell it to you, but it's too long for this PowerPoint. So anyways, there are different types of supervision. I can tell you, just kind of depends on many different things. A bank supervision, B-A-N-K, bank supervision is basically when you have, and this literally happens, Fresno specifically, you could have 1,000 cases on your caseload. And ultimately, you will put them in a drawer unless they do something. Their files, not the people. Sorry, you put their files in a drawer, and you might meet them once, and then you put their files in a drawer until their probation expires. I know, but this does happen. And I've worked before in an area where adult supervision where we had thousands on our caseloads. Thousands. It's completely unmanageable. These people are never seen. They are not supervised. It's very sad. Regular supervision for the adult world, we're talking hundreds. Caseload supervision, there might be different types of caseloads. Maybe you have a caseload of sex offenders. Maybe you have a caseload broken down by alphabet. You know, you have everybody with the last name A through F. Maybe you have a certain zip code in the city of Fresno. They break these down in many different ways. It just depends on what your agency chooses to do. Surveillance style supervision. Now, if you're doing things like GPS, electronic monitoring, things like that, those would be more of a surveillance style. And you could do an intensive supervision. Now, your high risk offenders are typically going to be under an intensive supervision type of supervision, where they would have much smaller caseloads. A lot of times would be on a GPS supervision they would have a GPS tracker, and they would have to be in contact with their probation officer very frequently, as opposed to these people under bank up here who might never see their PO. It sounds ridiculous. Unfortunately, what I'm telling you is absolutely, positively true. Specialized caseloads, we do a lot of this in Fresno as well. If you are in a gang, it's very likely that you're going to be on a gang caseload. And it's really important, and it's helpful if you are a gang officer, you know more about what to look for in a gang offender. And I'm going to give you an example. I worked at Hoover High School, and everybody knows, if you're working in the field, you know everything, a lot about, let's say, the Bulldog Street Gang. It's pretty common knowledge. Probably in general in the Fresno area, but certainly if you've worked in law enforcement or corrections in the Fresno area, you know a lot about what to look for when you're looking for a Bulldog gang member. Well, I had a young man on my caseload. He was not a Bulldog gang member, and he was a member of another gang, and I was not familiar with this gang's colors. So he wore gray to school every day. Head to toe gray. He was all gray. I had no idea that this was the color of, gosh, I can't remember now. It was Asian Boys or TRG, Tiny Rascals Gang. I can't remember. It was one of the local Southeast Asian gangs. But I didn't know. I didn't know that. I was not in the gang. I didn't have a gang caseload. I had a high school. I was broken down by my school. So when the gang officers came to, say hello and check out what was going on at Hoover, they were like, "Oh, that guy's Asian Boys," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, he is." And how did you know? And they said, "Well, he's wearing all gray." I had no idea. I was not an expert in gangs, so I didn't know that. Having a specified gang caseload was a positive. He probably should have been on that caseload because I didn't know. Should I have known? Probably, but I didn't. Auto theft, there are certain types of things. Clearly, we have enough auto thieves in Fresno to have a caseload of just auto theft. High-risk offenders, again, 1 PO, all the high-risk offenders. Sex offenders, this is another one. There's certain things that the PO is more in tune with, the things that sex offenders do that maybe your average PO isn't looking for. Domestic violence, drug offenders, DUI, mentally ill offenders. So these are all just specialized caseloads. There are different types of terms and conditions of probation. There are some terms and conditions that are fairly standard that most people on probation are subject to. Those things are common, like obey all laws. That's a standard term and condition of probation. Basically, almost everyone who is on probation has been ordered to obey all laws. Report to probation. Maintain contact with your PO. Almost everybody on probation has that. It's standard. Then we have specialized orders. By specialized, it's something that refers specifically to that offender or their offense. And you'll see that I use sex offenders a lot, sorry. But let's say this person is a sex offender. A special order for a sex offender might be, do not live near an elementary school. Do not give out Halloween candy. And yes, that is a term that is often ordered for sex offenders. So a standard term, something that most people on probation would have. Obey all laws. Report to your probation officer. A specialized term, something like don't give out Halloween candy if you're a sex offender. Don't hang around near elementary schools if you're a sex offender. I hope that makes sense, as I know I asked a question about that on the on the quiz. Okay, so before 1973, probationers really had no rights in court as to when their probation officer said they violated probation. But now, since 1973, it's very different. It's an entire court process. If I say someone violated their probation, I have to prove it in court. So there was, they have due process rights, and so if it wasn't a slam dunk, I wasn't going to take them back on a violation. But there are two types of violations or revocations. When you revoke something, you're taking it back. I'm taking back their granted probation, and I'm asking the judge to do something more severe, probably. So a technical violation of probation, something like the offender moved and didn't tell me where his new address. Think about it. If you move and you're not on probation, is that illegal? No. It's only illegal because you're on probation. It's a technical violation of your probation. A new crime violation means you went out and committed a new crime. Make sense? Technical violation. You're just violating the terms and conditions of probation. Versus a new crime, you committed a new law violation. These are the two different types of probation revocations. When one of these two things happens, your PO is taking you back to court and asking the judge for something more severe than what was happening before. Is probation effective? Oh, this is a tough one. As a former PO, I can tell you, no, it's not. Unless the offender wants it to be. So it's really hard. And if the PO wants to put in the work, I can only speak for what I did. Was I perfect? No, but did I really try? I felt like I really tried. And some of the offenders, if you don't want to change, you're not going to change. And so a lot of times it is like banging your head against the wall when you're trying to help people. But mixed results, 43% in 1986. So obviously this is a long time ago. 43% were rearrested after 3 years. Another study said that that 80% completed. Evidence-based practices focuses on smaller caseloads and focus on treatment. How can we have smaller caseloads right now? What do you guys think? Is it even kind of possible? It's absolutely impossible. Why? Because all of these offenders, our prisons are overcrowded, the caseloads are huge, and probation officers are drowning. I can tell you that from experience. So it's rough. It's a rough job. I loved it, but it was a rough job. Oh yeah, so how do we figure out where to put them? And when I say that, I mean like what type of supervision should they get? Someone reads the probation pre-sentence investigation report or a needs assessment, and they would classify them and decide which type of caseload they should go to. Every now and then I'd get a sex offender on my caseload at Hoover, and I would say, whoa, did somebody not read this? And they're like, yeah, his sex offense wasn't that bad, so we just decided to give him to you. And I was like, wait a minute. Anyways, yeah. So intermediate sanctions. How much more do we have here? Holy cow, we have a lot left. Okay. Intermediate sanctions. These are things that fall between probation and imprisonment. Okay, we're going to talk about a day reporting center as a good example of that. Maybe even a group home or a boot camp. But we're going to talk a little bit more. But these are some other examples. Fines, restitution, victim compensation, meaning paying the victim back, cost of supervision. This part is an additional slap in the face to people on probation when I tell them they have to pay me to arrest them. Well, when I used to tell them that. And then asset forfeiture. If people can't prove that Lamborghini that they have is something they bought with money they earned as opposed to drug money, that's getting taken as well. So these are just some examples of intermediate sanctions. We already talked about intensive supervision, so these are just some more examples of that. Day reporting centers are new, relatively new, like within the last 10 or 15 years, which to you probably doesn't seem new. To me it does. Day reporting centers are places where offenders will go and spend the day, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. They either go to school if they're juveniles, or go to treatment and or vocational drug treatment programs. They go try and do resumes, apply for jobs, all that kind of stuff. They're basically supervised from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, in these day reporting centers, and then they go home at night. They're supposed to be receiving services in order to make them their transition to the community easier. Sometimes we have split sentences where they go to jail for short periods of time, and then they are released on probation. These are typically going to be felons, by the way. Shock incarceration. Typically, we're talking about going into custody for short periods of time, even in a boot camp type program. These are not very common anymore. Shock probation. This is another one that we used to use quite a bit. Arrest people, put them in custody for 10 days or so, let them out, and hope that the 10 days in custody will make their behavior change. Another kind of absolute failure, in my opinion. But we tried, you know. Okay, and this is the last slide, because this is the concepts it's hardest for me to explain. This is the actual definition that comes out of the book. The overlapping of criminal sanctions and added supervision for community-placed offenders rather than diversion of offenders from prison. Okay, so net widening. Let me give you an example that does not include the criminal justice system. Imagine you are a fisherman and you want to catch tuna. And you go out into the sea, the big, wide open sea, and you throw a giant net out into the sea. And you reel that net in, and you have some tuna in there. But you also have a couple sharks and some rays and a few turtles and some seals and a bunch of other stuff that you really don't want. But it all got caught in your net, so you're going to bring it in anyway. Okay, so keep that in mind. Then think about people getting sucked into programs simply because there's bed space in that program. And let me use the example of, we used to have a boot camp program here in Fresno County. And there were times when our population was low. So you can imagine that there was pressure sometimes to fill those beds. Do you think we always waited for the perfect client to fill that bed with? Or do you think that possibly we just took who we could get and put that person in that bed so that we wouldn't lose the money? So ultimately what I'm trying to say is, sometimes the criminal justice system, they have all these awesome programs, but they don't always have the perfect client for that program, so they start pulling people into the system that don't really need to be in the system just because they have a program. I hope that makes sense. Anyways, there's my attempt at explaining net widening. All right, so chapter, I think that's 4. Done.